had to have occurred. So either logging, where we're taking part of the overstory from maybe just cutting one tree here and there, a selection cut, all the way up through clear cutting, where we're taking all of the trees in a certain area in the forest. And then understory treatments such as controlled burns and using herbicide applications or scarification, all of these then used to control competing vegetation. And then another thing that showed up quite a bit were in the methods were exclosures or enclosures were in a few. So either keeping granivores or herbivores out of an area and watching what happens there, or in a few select studies, there were actually measured numbers of white-tailed deer kept inside enclosures at certain densities to try to measure that direct impact from a known deer density. All right, so July 28th, 2020 was the final Web of Science search. And I searched a topic search there had to be a combination of two different topic search terms. So the first was hardwood forest regeneration or hardwood forest management, coupled with one of the second topic search terms, either herbivory, granivory, wildlife, browse, or seeds. And then that resulted in 3,343 papers. So it was kind of like this large tree here. I had all these papers studying all this different stuff, but remember that they have to fit in to this three kind of criteria that I told you about earlier. So there had to be a silviculture application and then a measure of granivory or herbivory after, and then also a measurement of regeneration of the forest, which then narrowed this review down to 116 papers. So a smaller tree, more manageable amount of papers to look at. So from those 116 papers, you're seeing a map placed over the ecoregions where all of these studies occurred. And some of the papers, of course, gave exact coordinates. Other papers gave general location names, and then I approximated their locations. And then other papers, if there were study areas that were spread out, I would just use the centroid for where those studies were. Like say there was like 15 plots in the Allegheny Forest in Pennsylvania. There's just one point there for that. So in the orange oval, you can see these are studies that occurred in central and also southern hardwood forests. And these are in the eastern temperate forest ecoregion, and they're dispersed pretty good, a good cover down there. And then in the northern forests, these are all the studies kind of look like they're on the bottom, but that's because they're the northern hardwood forests. And as you go further north, you transition into boreal forests. All right, so the paper breakdown. Out of the 116 papers, only 13 discussed or looked at granivory, and 98 studied herbivory. So it's, if you think of it as like a scale, herbivory is outweighing granivory here. And then only 5 of them actually looked at both granivory and herbivory at the same time within the same study. And then over time, looking at the number of papers on these topics that were done starting in the 1940s and moving up through the decades, there is a slow increase until the past 2 decades where you see a lot more studies occurring on this topic. So first, I'm going to talk about granivory, the granivory papers, those 13. There were 6 overstory treatments that were measured in all of those, and only 2 understory treatments out of the 3 that I mentioned. And then 5 of these 13 papers used a control, and For all of these, the controls are either a secondary growth forest that was not cut during the same time as the management being done in the study, or a comparison to an old growth forest. So it could be one of those two. And then there was one paper that had a seeding component in this, in the granivory studies. And then also one paper that had a exclosure to keep granivores out from seeds that were available. And then the majority of these studies were actually done in the central hardwood forest type, with only 3 in northern hardwood forest and 1 in a southern bottomland forest. Next, for herbivory, all 6 overstory treatments were done, but as you can see, there's a pattern. There's not many studies done on seed trees, which is where you leave just a handful of trees per acre to seed the next generation. And then 3 of the understory treatments were looked at in these studies, and with scarification being noticeably lower than fire, which are controlled burns, or herbicide spraying for unwanted vegetation. And then 16 of these studies had controls, with 11 using either plantings or seedings, and then 39 using exclosures, with that 2 studies that I mentioned using enclosures where they kept white-tailed deer in specified numbers to see what would happen. And then within these 98 papers, 4 of them were actually restoration studies where they were restoring old mining sites and trying to reforest that area. 2 used hunting as a deer reduction method, and then 3 actually looked at fertilizer to see if you could increase growth rates of seedlings and saplings to get them out of the browse zone faster. All right. And then for both of them, meaning the 5 papers that looked at both herbivory and granivory at the same time, all but seed tree were looked at for overstory treatments. And then we're back to just a couple looking at controlled burns or herbicide for understory treatments. There was 1 control, 1 planting, and then 2 exclosures used, and there was no restoration, deer reduction, or fertilizer. And I did forget to mention, actually, for the herbivory studies, there were 24 that were done in central hardwoods, 55 were done in northern hardwoods, and 5 were done in southern bottomland forests, with 14 crossing multiple forest types. And then for these 5 studies here, there were 4 in central hardwoods and 1 in northern forest types. So depending on what was actually being looked at, granivory, herbivory, or both, they're done unevenly in the different forest types. And then looking at the wildlife, these are the wildlife that were studied in the granivory studies. 1 for most of these, with small mammals just grouped together in 5 of the papers. And then just a couple highlights. Foraging movements and seed dispersal are dependent on the amount of seed and tree species in the area. And then eastern chipmunks will forage in clear cuts, while gray squirrels were more apt to forage in closed canopy forests. And then for the 98 herbivory studies, you should notice that white-tailed deer were in 91 of those studies, and some other herbivores were only in 1 or a handful of studies. So white-tailed deer taking the lead for the number of species studying herbivory in hardwood forests. And we know that extremely overabundant ungulates negatively impact forest regeneration, but that depending on the forest type, the predator community, or the silviculture method, you get varying results from how negative to negligible these impacts are. And then the 5 papers that looked at both of these, you can see, except for the 5, or white-tailed deer were in all 5 of them, but most of the other species were only looked at in 1 study. And it was the same study actually that looked at many of these. And then while managing for woodpeckers, forage increase for deer. In central hardwoods, hickory nuts are more likely to be eaten right away, while acorns are more likely to be stored. And then gap edges showed the highest densities of natural oak germination, with granivory impacts similar regardless of the gap size. And then just some granivory conclusions. Mast years are really important. Granivory has negative impacts in low seed production years, but benefits from small mammal caches and mast years. That's where you get seed dispersal. Forest management should be a matrix of clear cuts to mature forests to benefit the variety of granivorous wildlife species. And then the greater numbers of small mammal predators actually results in more seeds being immediately eaten. And then mast years also were found to reduce herbivory. So where red oak had mast years, it reduces the amount of impact from herbivory from white-tailed deer. And when there's predators in the area, saplings are browsed less than when there are not. And small gaps show less browse from white-tailed deer than large or medium or large gaps. So then overall studies have measured herbivory more than granivory, with white-tailed deer being measured the most. But there's not like one number of deer density or silviculture or forest type that really kind of indicates like a one prescription for the forest. So the bottom line is just more diverse and structurally complex forests have greater number of wildlife species that eat and they're dispersed tree seeds. And then there's less impacts from herbivory from that. And I would like to thank all of these groups and take questions.
Great, thank you so much, Melissa. So we had time for questions. If anyone has those, you can put those in the chat or raise your hand. And we have a first question to start us off. How many studies had replication of multiple silvicultural treatments?
There's a handful of them that had multiple silvicultural treatments, but a lot of times it was either using a control or selection silviculture is used. I didn't add that into the control because it is a silviculture method, but a lot of times it'll be like selection silviculture versus another type of silviculture. And that's about it.
Okay, great. Next question. If we could diversify our mast producing species in the canopy so that masting was potentially spread across more years, could this be a strategy to reduce herbivory?
It seems like it because the more food available, it's kind of like a buffet. If you only have one plate available to eat from, then you're going to eat all of it. But if you have a whole buffet, then you're going to have more available options and then eat less of each of those things. Just like with the red oak mast years, reducing deer herbivory. And a lot of these just kind of concluded that, like I said, the more biodiverse forests are, the less negative impacts on any single tree species or group of tree species that seem to happen.
We have any other questions? Okay, got one more. Was masting in this study looked at on the population level, or were community level masting studies looked at to get an understanding of the interaction of masting patterns between tree species and how that may affect the seed spreader populations?
Most of the masting studies were just looked at red oak or sometimes the oak group. And there was actually only one study that looked at multiple like community level masting events across different tree species, if that's what you meant, Jillian. And then I think only a handful of those studies also looked at year and seeding events as part of their methods, if I remember it right.
I think we have time for about one more question, if anyone has any.